Yo, what's up, everyone? It's your boy Disaster. Welcome to a place where there's no turning back. This is a marathon designed to put you under. Whether it's scorching summer or a rainy spring outside, forget about it. In here, the rain never stops, and the year is nothing but a bone-chilling, frozen winter. The sky out there, it's never gonna clear up. Here's the deal, and I need you to follow my lead. Get to your room, kill the lights, and throw on your headphones. Lay back, get comfortable, and hit that auto replay setting. Close both eyes, and listen till the very end. I'm telling you, the dread levels are gonna spike with every passing minute. And look, before we dive into the abyss, if you feel like this hour of horror is worth it, smash that like button. It doesn't cost you a dime, but it means the world to me. I put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into crafting this hour-long nightmare just for you. Brace yourself, boss, it's time for some ice-cold horror. Enjoy the ride. The iron head of Sherlock Holmes's heavy walking stick slammed straight into the rusted latch of the basement door. Clack. Crack. The lock snapped, the wood splintered, and the heavy door blew wide open. A thick, suffocating cloud of jet-black coal gas hit us square in the face. It didn't just smell like smoke, it was pure poison, heavy, sulfurous, and freezing cold, lung-searing air that instantly burned the back of my throat. I stumbled back a step, coughing hard, but Holmes didn't even flinch. He kicked the door all the way back against the damp brick wall and lunged into the pitch-black basement. I pulled my handkerchief over my mouth and ran in right behind him. The air inside was so thick with poisonous fumes that the yellow beam from my hand lantern barely cut through 2 feet of the gloom. The stone floor beneath our boots was slick with sewage and cold condensation. "Over here, Holmes!" I yelled, my voice choked and hoarse. On the cold flagstones directly in front of us lay a man on his back. I dropped to my knees beside him, my trousers soaking up the filthy water on the floor. I turned his head toward the lantern light, and my blood ran cold. The man's entire head was wrapped tight in heavy, thick black adhesive tape, layered over his mouth, his nose, and his jaw like a mummy. Only 2 tiny, torn pinholes were left over his nostrils, and they were completely plugged with black soot. His eyes were wide open, bloodshot, and bulging out of his skull in a frozen expression of absolute, agonizing terror. I pulled out my pocket knife, sliced through the sticky tape across his throat, and pressed 2 fingers hard against his carotid artery. The flesh was ice cold. "He's barely got a pulse, Holmes," I shouted over the sound of the furnace rattling in the corner. "His lungs are completely starved. He's suffocating to death right in front of us." Holmes didn't say a single word. He didn't even look down at the dying man. He turned on his heel, sprinted across the basement, and planted his boots right in front of the small, iron-barred cellar window at the far end of the room. He raised his heavy brass-headed stick with both hands, reeled back, and drove it with brutal, terrifying force directly into the glass and iron frame. Crash! Crack! Bang! Glass shattered into 100 jagged shards, the rusted iron bars buckled, and a rush of freezing cold, rainy London air surged into the room. The swirling black coal smoke was instantly sucked out toward the broken frame like a roaring draft. I took a deep breath of fresh air, wiped the stinging tears from my eyes, and scanned the far corner of the room with my lantern. Tied to a heavy oak chair near the wall was a second man. His arms were bound behind his back with thick hemp rope, his head flopped forward onto his chest, and his body was twitching violently in silent convulsions. "Meltas!" I called out, scrambling across the floor toward him. I whipped out my knife again, grabbed the rope around his wrists, and sawed through the heavy fibers in 3 swift strokes. The moment the rope snapped, the Greek interpreter collapsed forward straight into my chest. His fingers, cold, stiff, and trembling, clawed desperately into the damp wool of my heavy overcoat. His lips were dark blue, his face was pale as a sheet, and his eyes rolled back in his head as he fought for one last gasp of oxygen. He dragged me down by my collar, pulled his face right up to my ear, and rasped a single, shivering word through his blood-flecked teeth before dropping completely unconscious in my arms. They killed Cratides. This whole nightmare actually started 48 hours earlier inside the quiet, smoke-filled walls of 221B, Baker Street. It was a miserable, rain-drenched Tuesday evening in July. The city outside was buried under a thick, suffocating mantle of yellow fog that rolled off the Thames, turning the gas lamps into dim, ghostly blurs against the wet pavement. Holmes was sitting in his usual armchair by the fireplace, completely motionless. He hadn't uttered a single syllable in over 3 hours. His thin, sharp features were etched into a mask of cold concentration, his long fingers laced tightly together under his chin like a spider waiting in the dark for a fly to hit its web. Then, without a single knock or warning, the front door downstairs rattled violently, followed by heavy, desperate footsteps scrambling up the wooden staircase. The door to our sitting room slammed open. A man staggered into the room, drenched to the skin, his heavy wool coat dripping water onto our carpet. But he wasn't just cold, he was trembling so violently that his knees buckled right in front of the hearth. His face was a stark, ghostly white, the color of a corpse dug fresh out of wet clay. This was Mr. Melas, the well-known Greek interpreter living in London, a mild-mannered man who had no idea that his fluency in his native tongue was about to drag him straight into hell. He dropped to his knees right on our rug, his breathing coming in ragged, wheezing gasps as he grabbed the cuff of my trousers. "Help him, for God's sake, help him," he choked out, his bloodshot eyes darting wildly around the room. "They're starving him in the dark. They're beating him with iron rods, trying to force a signature out of a dying man." Holmes didn't waste a second on dramatic questions. He stepped forward, grabbed Melas under the arms, and hauled him up into the armchair, shoving a glass of stiff brandy directly into his shaking hands. "Drink it, Mr. Melas," Holmes commanded, his voice sharp and level. "Start from the beginning. Every detail, every name, every turn of the road." Melas took a frantic gulp of brandy, wiping his mouth with a trembling sleeve, and began to lay out the horrific trap he had walked into 2 nights ago. He told us that a stranger had walked into his office late Monday evening. The man called himself Harold Latimer, a tall, sharply dressed fellow with a voice as cold and thin as a razor blade and pale, unblinking eyes that made your skin crawl. Latimer offered Melas a massive sum of money for an urgent, highly confidential translation job that had to be done immediately that night. The only condition was absolute silence. No questions, no names, no delay. Melas accepted. But the moment he stepped inside the dark, heavy carriage waiting at the curb, the trap snapped shut. The wooden window shutters of the carriage were instantly bolted shut from the outside, plunging the interior into pitch blackness. Before Melas could even shout, a heavy, foul-smelling canvas hood was shoved over his head, pinned tightly around his neck. For 2 agonizing hours, the carriage tore through the dark streets of London, making sharp, repeated turns in endless circles designed to completely destroy his sense of direction. The only sound in the suffocating darkness was the rhythmic clatter-clack of iron horseshoes striking wet cobblestones, driving him deeper and deeper into the unknown. When the carriage finally screeched to a halt, 2 men grabbed Melas by the elbows, dragged him out into the cold rain, and forced him down a flight of narrow stone steps leading into a subterranean basement beneath a dead silent, isolated house. And when they finally ripped the black hood off his head, Melas found himself standing face to face with a scene of absolute, cold-blooded savagery. Melas stared into the glowing embers of our hearth, his hands shaking so violently that the amber brandy sloshed over the rim of his glass, dripping onto his trousers like cold rain. The room was a circular stone vault, Melas whispered, his voice trembling with a raw, primal terror that filled the silence of 221B, Baker Street. There were no windows, no rugs, no furniture, just a single tallow candle melting away on a battered wooden crate in the center of the floor. The stone walls were slick with black mold, running with moisture that caught the pale yellow light like grease. He took a shivering breath, his knuckles turning white around the glass. In the middle of that damp cellar, bolted securely to a heavy iron frame, sat the prisoner. At first glance, I didn't even realize I was looking at a living human being. He was a skeleton, a man starved down to nothing. His suit was ripped to shreds, caked in dried mud and dark, rusty bloodstains around the collar. But his face, my God, his face. Melas buried his face in his hands for a second, shuddering before looking up at Holmes. It was the man I now know as Paul Cratides. His entire head was wrapped tight in endless layers of thick, industrial black adhesive tape. It was wound over his forehead, his cheeks, and his mouth, binding his jaw shut like an iron clamp. They had cut two jagged, miserable little holes over his nostrils just to keep him from suffocating on his own breath. His eyes were bright red, completely bloodshot, staring out from behind that black tape with a look of helpless, screaming agony. Holmes leaned forward in his armchair, his gray eyes narrowing into two sharp slits, taking in every single detail without uttering a sound. Standing right behind the chair, Melas continued, was Harold Latimer. He was wearing black leather gloves, his fingers resting casually on top of the bound man's skull as if he were holding down a piece of luggage. Beside him stood a second man, a short, squat brute with a face horribly disfigured by old fire scars. His left cheek was a mass of twisted, purple flesh, and he was grinning, a sick, silent grin, while flipping a long, double-edged Greek dagger back and forth in his palm. Latimer didn't waste a second. He reached into his coat, slapped a thick stack of legal documents and a fountain pen onto the wooden crate, and grabbed Melas by the back of the neck with a grip like an iron vice. "Translate, Mr. Melas," Latimer snarled, his thin voice slicing through the cold cellar air like a scalpel. "Tell our Greek friend that his time has officially run out. He signs these papers right now, transferring every acre, every property, and every red cent of his sister Sophie's estate in Athens over to my name, or my friend here starts taking his fingers off, one by one, right over this candle flame." Melas shuddered as he recounted the horror of that moment. I translated the words into Greek, my voice cracking with fear. The poor man on the chair couldn't speak through the heavy cloth binding his mouth, he could only let out these awful, muffled groans from deep in his throat. But despite the unbearable pain, despite his starvation, he shook his head back and forth in a frantic, absolute refusal. Then, taking advantage of the fact that neither Latimer nor his scarred henchman understood a word of Greek, Cratides squeezed his eyes shut and rasped out a muffled sentence through his nose, using every ounce of strength left in his broken body. "Where is my sister, Melas? What have these devils done to Sophie?" The scarred brute stepped forward, driving the cold tip of his dagger right against Cratides' exposed collarbone until a thin trickle of dark blood leaked onto his shirt. "Tell him his dear sister is right upstairs," the scarred man laughed, a wet, guttural sound. "She's locked in the parlor, eating well, waiting for his signature so she can go home. If he signs, he gets to see her." If he refuses, she stays our guest forever, and he goes under the cellar floorboards. Melas tried to slide a secret warning into his Greek translation, whispering under his breath while pretending to deliver Latimer's threat, "Hold on. I'm trying to figure out where we are, don't give up." But Latimer wasn't an idiot. He caught the subtle change in Melas's tone. In one blinding flash of movement, Latimer yanked a heavy, nickel-plated revolver from his coat pocket, stepped around the chair, and jammed the cold steel barrel directly against the center of Melas's forehead. "Translate only what I tell you to translate, you sniveling little worm." Latimer hissed, his pale eyes burning with a sudden, psychotic rage. "Add one single word of your own, and I will put a bullet through your skull and dump you right next to him." The icy steel of Latimer's revolver barrel remained pressed firmly against Melas's forehead, leaving a dark, circular impression on his pale skin. I nodded frantically. Melas rasped out, his breath coming in ragged hitches as he relived the terror inside our room at Baker Street. I raised my hands, choking back my own tears, and repeated Latimer's brutal ultimatum word for word. But Cratides was unbreakable. Even with a gun to my head, even with the scarred devil pressing that double-edged blade deeper into his collarbone, the bound man kept shaking his head back and forth in a slow, defiant, hopeless absolute refusal. Seeing that torture and death threats wouldn't break the starving Greek's resolve, Latimer snapped. He let out a low, bitter curse, shoved his revolver back into his coat, and grabbed the black canvas hood off the floor. Before Melas could say another word, the suffocating cloth was shoved back over his head, blinding him once more in total darkness. They hauled him to his feet by his coat collar, dragged him up the narrow stone stairs, and threw him headfirst into the waiting, blacked-out carriage. The journey back was a nightmare, Melas continued, wiping a line of cold sweat from his forehead. They drove me in circles for another 2 endless hours. When the carriage finally slammed to a halt, the scarred brute opened the door, dragged me out into an alley, and shoved me face down into the cold mud of a deserted street. He leaned over me, jammed the cold tip of his dagger against my ear, and whispered, "If you speak a single word of this to a living soul, to the police, or to anyone in London, we will find you, cut your tongue out, and slit your throat from ear to ear." The moment Melas finished his story, Sherlock Holmes sprang up from his armchair like an uncoiling steel spring. The lazy, contemplative mood that had hung over him all evening vanished in an instant, replaced by a cold, predatory energy that always made my blood run fast. He strode across the room, grabbed his heavy wool overcoat, and flung it over his shoulders. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice sharp and incisive as a surgeon's blade, "grab your service revolver, the Webley, and check your ammunition. This isn't a mere kidnapping or a crude extortion racket. This is a cold, calculated campaign of torture and murder designed to liquidate an entire wealthy Greek family, and the monsters running this operation won't hesitate for a fraction of a second to murder everyone involved the moment they feel the net tightening." I scrambled to my feet, pulled my heavy .455 Webley from my desk drawer, verified the 6 lead cartridges resting in the cylinder, and jammed it securely into my side pocket. "Where do we start, Holmes?" I asked, pulling on my boots. London is a vast maze, and Melas was driven blindfolded for hours. "We start with the newspapers, Watson," Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming with a fierce, calculating light. "An attractive young Greek woman named Sophie Cratides doesn't simply vanish into the shadows of London without leaving an impression. Latimer brought her here under the guise of romance, locked her away, and used her as leverage to lure her brother from Athens straight into a trap. We must put an advertisement in every major morning paper offering a reward for her whereabouts." He grabbed his hat and stick, but just as our boots hit the top step of the stairs, a furious knocking rattled the front door downstairs. I rushed down and threw the door open. Standing on the rain-slicked doorstep was a young telegraph boy, shivering in the cold fog, holding a damp yellow envelope in his hand. Holmes snatched the telegram from the boy's fingers, tore it open under the hallway gas lamp, and read the hastily scribbled lines in a single glance. In all my years of writing alongside Sherlock Holmes, I had rarely seen his face change color so drastically. His jaw tightened, his gray eyes flared with a sudden, dangerous intensity, and he looked up at me. "We are out of time, Watson," Holmes snapped, shoving the telegram straight into my hand. "The net isn't tightening, it's snapping shut." I scanned the jagged handwriting on the slip. The message was from a friend of Melas's who lived near his flat. "Melas has been taken again. 2 men forced him into a covered cab 10 minutes ago. Neighbors report smoke and the smell of burning coal rising from the cellar of an abandoned mansion in Beckenham." Holmes didn't say another word. He bolted out the front door, sprinted directly into the middle of Baker Street, and flagged down a passing hansom cab, shouting over the roar of the pouring rain, £10 to the driver if you reach Beckenham in under 30 minutes. Drive like the devil himself is behind you. The driver whipped the horses into a gallop, the iron shoes sparking against the wet asphalt as the hansom cab roared through the storm toward the dark outskirts of Beckenham. Inside the cab, the silence was deafening. Holmes sat opposite me, rigid, his face illuminated only by the flashes of street lamps outside. He held his revolver resting flat on his knee, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window with an icy intensity. "If they have brought Melas back to that basement, Watson," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the sound of the storm, "it means they are wrapping up their business. They know we are close. Latimer and his henchmen are preparing to wipe the slate clean, and that means leaving 4 dead bodies behind in the dark." 20 minutes later, the cab screeched to a halt on a deserted lane bordered by oaks. The fog here hung heavy, smelling of wet earth, rotting leaves, and cold dampness. "Stay here with the cab," Holmes ordered the driver, slipping a gold sovereign into his palm. "If you hear gunfire, don't wait for us, drive straight to the nearest police station." We jumped into the cold mud, pulled our overcoats tight around us, and slipped through the overgrown iron gates of a massive, decaying mansion shrouded in darkness. The house looked like a tomb, its Gothic windows were completely blacked out, covered in thick ivy and dead vines that clung to the brickwork like skeletal fingers. We crept silently around the perimeter of the house, our boots making no sound on the wet grass. "Look there, Watson," Holmes whispered, pointing a gloved finger toward the base of the rear wall. At the bottom of a stone light well, half hidden behind iron grates, a tiny subterranean window was glowing with a faint orange light. As we drew closer, a thick plume of black coal smoke began billowing out from the cracks in the masonry, carrying a suffocating stench that made my throat seize up. "It's coal gas," I gasped, pulling my handkerchief over my nose. "They've sealed the cellar vents and filled the room with poisonous fumes." Holmes didn't hesitate. He sprinted down the stone steps leading to the cellar entrance and slammed his shoulder against the heavy oak door. It didn't budge, a massive iron latch was bolted securely across the frame. "Stand back, Watson," Holmes roared. He gripped his walking stick with both hands, reeled back, and struck the iron latch with a series of brutal, bone-shattering blows. Clack! Crack! Boom! The rusted iron screws tore out of the rotting wood, the lock snapped, and the door flew open. A thick, billowing wall of black poison burst out of the doorway, engulfing us in a wave of blinding smoke. Coughing violently, eyes burning with hot tears, we plunged straight into the darkness of the cellar. The scene inside was a nightmare rendered in horror. In the center of the room, tied to a wooden chair, was Melas, his head slumped forward, his chest heaving in silent spasms as he fought for oxygen. On the cold, flooded flagstones beside him lay Paul Cratides, immobile, his face still bound in thick black adhesive tape. I lunged straight for Melas, pulled out my knife, and slashed the ropes binding his arms and legs. "I've got him, Holmes. Get him out to the fresh air," I yelled, hauling the unconscious interpreter over my shoulder and scrambling back up the stone steps into the rain. I dropped Melas onto the wet grass, dropped to my knees, and began pumping his chest, forcing fresh air back into his poisoned lungs until he let out a harsh cough and shuddered to life. "Cratides!" I shouted, turning back toward the basement doorway. "Holmes, is he breathing?" Inside the gloom, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the cellar as Holmes smashed the window frame to vent the remaining gas. I sprinted back down the steps and knelt beside the cold body of the millionaire. I sliced through the thick tape covering his nose and mouth, wiped the soot from his face, and pressed my fingers against his neck. There was no pulse. Not a flutter. Not a single heartbeat. His eyes, staring blindly into the rafters above, were already glazed over with the cold film of death. "We're too late for Cratides, Watson," Holmes said, his voice dropping into a calm as he stepped out of the shadows. "The poison finished him minutes before we broke the door." Holmes knelt beside the corpse, pulled out his magnifying glass, and began examining the hands with precision. Suddenly, his fingers paused. Bound tightly inside the dead man's rigid left fist was a cluster of long, light blonde hair, torn out by the root in a desperate struggle. Holmes stood up, staring down at the hair in his palm, his eyes reflecting the dark, murderous storm outside. "Latimer and his scarred friend didn't just leave a dead man behind, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice laced with a quiet fury. "They took the sister, and they think they've escaped into the fog. But they don't know that blood demands blood." We left Melas coughing on the wet grass outside while Inspector Gregson and a squad of Scotland Yard officers, alerted by our earlier telegram, finally swarmed the grounds of the Beckenham mansion. While the police began securing the murder scene and lifting Cratides' cold body onto a stretcher, Holmes turned his lantern toward the upper levels of the house. "The dead man has given us his final clue, Watson," Holmes said, gesturing toward the stairs with his stick. "Let us see what horrors this house was built to hide." We hurried up the creaking wooden staircase to the main floor. The hallway smelled of old wallpaper, stagnant water, and damp wool. Holmes moved like a hunting hound on a fresh scent, his lantern beam darting across the dark oak floorboards until it settled on a heavy door at the end of the corridor. He turned the brass knob and pushed the door open. Inside was a small, dusty parlor. The window shutters were nailed tight with heavy iron spikes, completely cutting off the outside world. On the floor lay a shattered oil lamp, its glass shards scattered across a faded Persian rug. Next to the fireplace, bolted straight into the heavy brickwork, was a thick iron ring holding a severed length of heavy iron chain. I knelt down and picked up a piece of torn linen fabric lying near the chain. It was stained with fresh, dark blood. "She was locked in here for weeks, Holmes," I whispered, the sickening truth settling heavy in my chest. "Sophie Cratides. They chained her up like an animal while they tortured her brother in the cellar below." Holmes was on his hands and knees, his magnifying glass hovering mere inches above the floorboards. He picked up a small object near the doorway, a black leather glove, fine-grained, with a gold snap buckle. He held it up to the lantern light, examining a faint streak of wet, yellowish clay along the palm. "Latimer's glove," Holmes snapped, rising instantly to his feet. He dropped it in his hurry to drag the girl out of the house. "The clay on this leather is fresh, Watson, it hasn't even dried yet." They left this house less than 20 minutes before we smashed that basement door. He rushed out of the room and sprinted back down the stairs, shouting over his shoulder to Inspector Gregson, "Gregson, keep your men on the cellar. Melas needs immediate medical attention, but the killers are on the run." "Where are you going, Mr. Holmes?" Gregson called out from the front hall. "To the tracks." Holmes roared back without stopping. "Latimer knows the game is up in London. He has the signed land agreements, he has the sister, and his only chance of executing those forged deeds is to reach the continent before the news of Cratides's murder reaches the authorities." We burst through the front entrance, vaulted over the low stone wall of the estate, and ran straight down the muddy lane toward the small, isolated Beckenham railway station. The rain was falling in blinding sheets now, driven by a howling wind that tore through the trees. The station platform was deserted, wrapped in a thick blanket of yellow fog. The small ticket office was dark, but a faint light flickered inside the stationmaster's glass booth. Holmes slammed his palm against the glass, startling the elderly stationmaster inside. "The express train to Dover?" Holmes demanded, his voice slicing through the roar of the wind. "Has a private carriage or a special engine passed through this station in the last half hour?" The stationmaster blinked, pulling his spectacles down his nose in utter shock. "Why, yes, sir, about 15 minutes ago. Two gents in heavy dark cloaks came rushing in, dragging a young lady wrapped in a thick black shawl between them. She looked sick, could barely stand on her own feet. The taller gent threw a stack of banknotes at me and demanded an engine and a private carriage to take them straight to the South Coast piers." Holmes grabbed the lapels of my overcoat, his eyes flashing in the dim lamplight like polished steel. "They're heading for Dover, Watson. If they board a steamship for France or the Balkans, we will lose them forever in the maze of international border laws." He turned back to the terrified stationmaster, pulling out his heavy leather coin pouch and slamming a wad of cash onto the wooden counter. "Telegraph the main line controller at Croydon immediately. Order a fast police locomotive and a tender on the main track right now. Tell them Sherlock Holmes is commandeering the line on the authority of Scotland Yard." 5 minutes later, the heavy iron wheels of a special police locomotive were screaming against the rain-slicked rails as we tore south through the pitch-black night. The engine was a roaring furnace of coal fire and pressurized steam. The engineer kept his hand locked tight on the throttle, leaning out the side cab window into the driving rain, while Holmes stood right beside the firebox, his eyes fixed on the narrow beam of light cutting through the yellow fog ahead. "They have a 15-minute head start, Watson," Holmes shouted over the deafening roar of the pistons. "But a private, hired carriage engine is light, it lacks the traction of this heavy four-coupler. We will catch them before they hit the coastal switches at Dover." The train hammered down the dark tracks, leaning violently into the sharp turns through the Kent countryside. Trees flashed past like ghostly shadows in the dark, and every few miles, rain-drenched station platforms blurred past us in a flash of orange lantern light. I pulled my Webley revolver from my pocket, checked the 6 heavy lead rounds resting in the cylinder, and snapped it shut with a sharp, iron click. "Look ahead, Mr. Holmes," the engineer bellowed, pointing a black, coal-stained finger out the front cab glass. 2 miles down the straight line, twin red taillights were bobbing erratically through the fog. Latimer's hired locomotive was visible now, pushing hard, throwing clouds of white steam into the black sky. "Close the gap," Holmes yelled to the stoker. "Shovel more coal." Our engine roared, surging forward with a terrifying burst of speed. The distance between the two trains shrank rapidly, 500 yards, 300, 100. Suddenly, a glass window in the rear of the fleeing carriage ahead shattered inward. A dark figure leaned out into the howling gale, a revolver gleaming in his hand under the engine light. Bang! Bang! 2 gunshots cracked through the storm. Ripping through the rain, lead bullets slammed straight into the iron boiler plates of our cab with 2 terrifying, metallic clangs. "Get down, Watson!" Holmes roared, shoving me flat against the steel floorboards of the cab as sparks showered over us. I scrambled up, leaned out the left side of the cab, locked my elbows against the iron window frame, and aimed my Webley directly at the dark silhouette leaning out of the fleeing carriage ahead. Bang! The heavy .455 round tore through the carriage doorframe, shattering the wooden paneling. Latimer ducked back inside, but the sudden gunfight spooked their engine driver. Up ahead, the private locomotive hit a slippery section of track near a side junction, locked its brakes in panic, and began sliding wildly out of control. Screech! Boom! The private train skidded off the main line, its heavy iron wheels jumping the rails, slamming side first into a timber maintenance barrier near the edge of the embankment with a violent, bone-crunching crash. Our police engine ground to a halt 50 yards behind the wreck, locking its wheels and sending up a cloud of white steam and iron sparks into the freezing rain. Before the locomotive had even come to a full stop, Holmes and I vaulted down from the iron cab step, our boots slamming hard into the wet gravel along the track embankment. The wrecked private carriage was resting at a terrifying angle, half crushed against the broken wooden maintenance barriers. Twisted iron, shattered glass, and splintered teakwood were scattered across the stones. Smoke was pouring out of the ruined engine boiler ahead, hissing loudly as the cold rain hit the red-hot metal plates. "Keep your weapon drawn, Watson," Holmes shouted over the roaring escape of steam. "They won't go down without a fight." I raised my .455 Webley, holding it with both hands as we advanced through the thick fog and swirling steam. Suddenly, the shattered side door of the rear carriage burst outward with a loud crack. Out stepped the scarred brute, his face covered in fresh blood from a gash across his temple, but his grip on his Greek dagger was iron-tight. He was dragging Sophie Cratides out of the wreckage by her dark hair. She was pale, bruised, and weak from weeks of starvation, but her eyes were wild with fear. The brute kept her locked firmly against his chest as a human shield, pressing the cold, sharp edge of the blade directly against the soft skin under her jawline. Right behind him scrambled Harold Latimer. His left arm was hanging limp and useless at his side, broken from the impact of the crash, but his right hand was still holding his revolver, pointing it straight at my chest. "Back off, you fools!" Latimer screamed, his voice cracking with a high-pitched rage that cut right through the storm. One step closer and he cuts her throat from ear to ear. "Drop your guns right now or her blood is on your hands." The rain was pouring down in blinding sheets, running down my face and stinging my eyes. I kept the sight of my heavy Webley locked firmly on Latimer's chest, but the scarred brute was hiding almost entirely behind the trembling girl, making a clean shot impossible. "You've run out of track, Latimer," Holmes said, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp calm. He didn't drop his stick. Instead, he took one slow step sideways into the shadows of the embankment, drawing Latimer's eyes away from me. "Your plot in Beckenham is dead. Paul Cratides is dead. Scotland Yard has already surrounded the house, and your forged deeds aren't worth the paper they're written on." "He's lying," the scarred brute spat in a harsh accent, tightening his grip on Sophie's hair and pressing the steel blade deeper until a tiny bead of crimson blood appeared on her throat. "Kill them, Harold. Shoot them now." That tiny drop of blood broke the girl's paralysis. Sophie let out a desperate scream. Using every ounce of strength left in her broken body, she threw her head backward with force, slamming her skull straight into the scarred brute's broken nose. Crack! The brute howled in pain, his head snapping back as blood spurted from his nostrils. His grip on the dagger slipped for a fraction of a second. "Now, Watson!" Holmes roared. I didn't think, I acted on pure military instinct. I squeezed the trigger of my Webley, aiming straight for Latimer's right shoulder. Bang! The heavy lead slug tore straight through Latimer's collarbone. The force of the bullet spun him around like a ragdoll, smashing him back against the ruined wooden carriage paneling as his revolver flew out of his hand, clattering down the gravel slope. At the exact same instant, Holmes lunged forward like a striking cobra. He brought his walking stick down with terrifying force straight onto the scarred brute's right wrist. Crack! Snap! The brute let out a shriek as his wrist bone shattered under the heavy brass head, and the Greek dagger dropped uselessly into the mud. Before the brute could react with his left hand, I closed the distance, planted my boot squarely in the center of his chest, and kicked him hard off the embankment. He tumbled backward down the steep stone slope, slamming into the mud below. Holmes caught Sophie before she hit the ground, wrapping his heavy wool overcoat around her shivering shoulders as she collapsed into tears. "It's over, Miss Cratides," Holmes said softly, his stern face softening as he looked down at her. "You are safe now." I stepped over to Latimer, who was groaning in the mud, clutching his shattered shoulder as blood seeped through his coat. I kicked his fallen revolver far down the tracks, pulled out my handcuffs, and snapped the steel bracelets tight around his wrist. The sound of blaring police whistles and approaching steam engines echoed from the tracks behind us. Scotland Yard reinforcements had finally arrived, but as I looked at the pale, bloodied face of Harold Latimer staring up at me with pure hatred, I knew this dark game wasn't fully finished yet. 24 hours after the violent train crash near Dover, the high-profile arrest of Harold Latimer and his scarred henchman was splashed across the front page of every major newspaper in London. The press hailed Scotland Yard and Sherlock Holmes for dismantling the brutal extortion ring, rescuing Sophie Cratides, and putting an end to the dark nightmare that had terrorized Beckenham. Inspector Gregson took full credit before the reporters, proudly announcing that the law had prevailed and that both prisoners were locked securely behind the stone walls of Newgate Prison awaiting trial for kidnapping, extortion, and the murder of Paul Cratides. Everything seemed settled. Sophie Cratides was placed under medical care at a private clinic, Maylaws was recovering in his flat, and the case file appeared officially closed. Except for one thing, Sherlock Holmes wasn't celebrating. I found him sitting by the window in our sitting room at 221B, Baker Street, surrounded by a thick haze of blue tobacco smoke. He hadn't touched his breakfast, nor had he changed out of his dressing gown. His long, thin fingers were tapping a silent, rhythmic beat against the wooden arm of his chair, his eyes staring blankly at the rain pouring down outside. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked, laying the morning paper on the table beside him. "Latimer is behind bars, his henchman is crippled, and the young lady is safe. Why do you look as though we've lost?" "Because we are playing against an unseen hand, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice dropping into a low, icy register. "Look closer at the legal documents we recovered from Latimer's coat pocket. Latimer and his scarred friend were mere foot soldiers, violent thugs hired to execute a far larger, far more sophisticated international fraud." He reached over, picked up a sheaf of official papers tied with red ribbon, and slapped them down onto my lap. "Paul Cratides was a man of immense wealth," Holmes continued, rising from his chair and pacing the length of the room like a caged panther. "His real estate, shipping shares, and banking assets in Athens and Budapest amount to hundreds of thousands of pounds. But do you honestly believe a mid-level London crook like Latimer had the legal connections to forge international property transfers across 3 European borders overnight?" I scanned the dense, legalistic German and Hungarian text on the documents. These papers bear official notary seals from a banking syndicate in Buda. Precisely. Holmes interjected, pointing his pipe stem at the red wax seal. A powerful corrupt syndicate of Hungarian lawyers and underworld financiers organized this entire trap from behind the scenes. They used Latimer to secure Kratidis' signature by torture. And now that Latimer has failed, those same shadowy figures are moving to protect their fortune, and erase every single witness who knows the truth. Before I could answer, the door downstairs opened, and heavy, rushed footsteps echoed up the wooden staircase. Inspector Gregson burst into the room, his face pale, his official hat held tightly in his trembling hands. "Mr. Holmes," Gregson choked out, completely dropping his usual boastful swagger. "We have a disaster on our hands. A catastrophic failure at Newgate." Holmes didn't even look surprised, his jaw simply tightened into a line of hard iron. "Out with it, Gregson." "It happened an hour ago," Gregson rasped, wiping cold sweat from his forehead. A team of high-ranking international lawyers arrived at the magistrate's office with a writ of habeas corpus and an official diplomatic extradition warrant from the Austro-Hungarian embassy. They presented forged affidavits claiming Latimer and his accomplice are foreign political operatives immune to local summary jurisdiction. "And the magistrate bought it?" I asked, stunned. "The magistrate had no choice under the treaty, Dr. Watson." Gregson cried out defensively. Bail was set at an astronomical sum, and paid instantly in cash by a Hungarian agent. Latimer and his henchmen walked out of Newgate a free men 30 minutes ago. They were escorted straight into a private closed carriage and rushed toward the eastern docks. I sprang to my feet, my blood boiling with indignation. They bought their way out of a murder charge. "Not just bought their way out, Watson," Holmes said, his gray eyes flashing with a sudden, lethal intensity as he grabbed his heavy overcoat. "They are heading to Hungary to collect the stolen fortune and silence anyone who stands in their way. Grab your Webley revolver, Watson. The British courts may have failed, but our account with Harold Latimer is far from settled." The border between the Austrian Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary was shrouded in a bitter, bone-chilling November mist that rolled off the Danube River like cold gray steam. 3 weeks had passed since Harold Latimer and his scarred accomplice bought their freedom from the London magistrate. For 3 long weeks, Sherlock Holmes and I had trailed their dark, bloody shadow across the European continent, from the steamship piers of Rotterdam, through the fog-bound alleyways of Vienna, and deep into the mountainous heart of the Austro-Hungarian frontier. We were sitting in the corner of a dimly lit, smoke-filled tavern in the remote border village of Kiskin, near the Hungarian frontier. Outside, the wind howled through the bare pine trees, driving a mixture of sleet and gravel against the small glass window panes. Holmes sat motionless in his heavy fur-lined traveling cloak, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He was studying a map of the local estate roads, his long, thin index finger tracing a winding dirt track that led deep into the dense, uninhabited forests along the riverbank. "They think they have escaped the reach of the law, Watson," Holmes said quietly, his voice barely audible over the roaring fireplace and the coarse laughter of local peasants drinking plum brandy across the room. "In London, Latimer was forced to operate in the shadows, fearing Scotland Yard and the gallows. But here, on the private estates of his corrupt banking partners, he believes he is untouchable." I reached under my heavy coat, my fingers brushing against the cold iron frame of my loaded .455 Webley revolver. "What is our plan, Holmes? If they have taken refuge inside a fortified Hungarian manor, we have no legal authority, no warrants, and no local police to back us up." "We need no warrants where we are going, Watson," Holmes replied, his sharp gray eyes glittering in the firelight with a cold, ruthless brilliance. Latimer and his scarred brute didn't come to Hungary merely to hide. They came to finalize the fraudulent transfer of the Kratides fortune with their syndicate leader, a shadowy figure known in the local police records as Count Sendro. Before I could ask another question, the heavy oak door of the tavern burst open, sending a howling blast of icy wind and snow swirling across the wooden floorboards. A tall man stepped inside, wrapped in a dark, fur-trimmed Hungarian riding cloak, his boots caked in wet, frozen clay. He scanned the crowded room with sharp, dark eyes until his gaze settled on our corner table. He didn't say a word, he simply walked over, dropped a small, wax-sealed envelope onto our table, turned around, and walked back out into the storm. Holmes snatched the envelope, broke the dark red seal with his pocket knife, and unfolded the coarse parchment inside. Written across the page in sharp, elegant calligraphy was a single line in German. The ledger is being opened tonight at the old hunting lodge above the Danube Gorge. If you seek justice for Paul Kratides, come before the midnight bell. You will not be the only guests. I stared at the mysterious note, my brow furrowing in confusion. Who sent this, Holmes? Is it a trap set by Latimer to pull us into the woods? It is a message from an ally, Watson, Holmes whispered, folding the parchment and sliding it into his breast pocket. Or perhaps, an invitation to an execution. He stood up, pulled his collar high against the howling wind, and checked the heavy brass pocket watch in his hand. It is nearly 11 o'clock, Holmes said, his voice dropping into that razor-sharp tone that signaled the final spring of a hunt. The snow will cover our tracks. Bring your revolver, Watson, and keep your hand on the trigger. Tonight, in the dark woods above the river, the final act of the Greek interpreter's tragedy begins. The storm reached its absolute zenith as Holmes and I picked our way up the treacherous, frozen track leading to the old hunting lodge above the Danube Gorge. The wind howled through the towering pines like a choir of dying men, blowing thick curtains of snow across our path. Below us, hundreds of feet down the jagged cliff, the black, ice-swollen waters of the Danube roared against the jagged rocks. Perched right on the edge of the abyss sat the hunting lodge, a sprawling, dark timber fortress built from heavy pine logs, its sharp gables dusted in white snow. A single orange light flickered behind a leaded glass window on the top floor, but the ground level was completely wrapped in pitch-black silence. "Keep low, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice cutting through the shrieking wind as we crouched behind a snow-covered stack of firewood near the stone entrance. No raised lanterns. The front heavy doors are bolted from within. We crept around the side of the wooden structure, our boots sinking deep into the fresh snow. Suddenly, Holmes paused. His hand shot out and clamped onto my shoulder like a steel claw. He pointed down at the white snow right beneath the dark parlor window. There, freshly pressed into the drifts, were two distinct sets of boot prints leading straight toward the rear cellar door. But these were not European riding boots. The tread was deep, jagged, and uniquely crafted, the distinct leather work of Athenian mountain boots. "Look closer, Watson," Holmes whispered, his eyes gleaming in the dark. "The snow has only just begun to fill these tracks. Someone broke into this lodge less than 10 minutes ago, and they did not come from London or Hungary." Before I could answer, a blood-curdling shriek echoed from deep inside the timber walls, a high-pitched, agonizing scream of pure terror that cut straight through the howling storm. It was followed instantly by the heavy, dull thud of a body crashing violently against furniture, the metallic splintering of wood, and the frantic, desperate stamping of feet on the floorboards above. "Up the side balcony, Watson. Hurry!" Holmes shouted. We scrambled up the snow-slicked wooden ladder leading to the second-story balcony. Holmes drew his heavy stick, brought the brass head down hard on the window latch, and shoved the leaded glass pane open. We tumbled into the upper hallway, our revolvers drawn, and sprinted toward the door at the end of the corridor where the screams had originated. The door was standing half open, swinging wildly on its iron hinges in the icy draft. We burst into the room, our weapons raised, ready to fire. But the scene that met our eyes inside that candlelit study froze the blood solid in my veins. There was no firefight. There was no standoff. Standing in the center of the room, illuminated by the dying embers of a massive stone fireplace, was Harold Latimer. He was pinned flat against a heavy oak desk, his face contorted in a frozen, horrific mask of sheer agony. His eyes were wide open, bulging out of his skull, staring straight at the ceiling in blank, lifeless terror. Plunged straight through the center of his chest, buried all the way to the ivory hilt, was a long, double-edged Greek dagger, the exact same ancestral weapon that had been stolen from Paul Cratyides in Beckenham. Beside him, crumpled on the Persian rug in a pool of fresh, steaming blood, lay his scarred accomplice. His throat had been slit clean from ear to ear with a single, ruthless, surgical stroke. On the desk, right next to Latimer's dead hand, lay the stolen land deeds and property transfers, completely drenched in crimson blood. I dropped to my knees, pressing my fingers against Latimer's neck. The flesh was still warm, but the pulse was gone forever. "They're dead, Holmes," I rasped out, my voice shaking as I looked around the silent, blood-soaked study. "Both of them, killed in a matter of seconds." Holmes didn't answer. He walked slowly toward the open window on the far side of the room. The heavy velvet curtains were flapping wildly in the freezing gale, and fresh snow was dusting the hardwood floor. He leaned out the window, looking down at the narrow stone ledge that ran along the edge of the cliff wall, where a single set of bloody boot prints vanished into the dark, swirling storm toward the river below. Holmes reached down to the windowsill, picked up a small, wet object left behind in the snow, and held it up to the candlelight. It was a small, hand-woven Greek prayer bead, a traditional token of mourning carried by the ancient families of Athens. "The law in London failed, Watson," Holmes said softly, his voice full of a dark, grim solemnity as he looked out into the howling night. "The courts gave them bail, the Hungarian syndicate offered them shelter, but the blood of Paul Cratyides cried out from that cellar in Beckenham. The Greek retribution caught them in the dark, and the debt has officially been paid in full." The Hungarian police investigation into the double murder at the old hunting lodge concluded with a brief, dismissive official report published 3 days later in the local Budapest journals. The authorities, eager to avoid a drawn-out diplomatic scandal involving international fugitives and forged foreign deeds, officially ruled the bloody incident as a fatal, drunken brawl between two English criminals who had turned their knives on each other over the division of stolen loot. It was a neat, convenient lie that satisfied the local magistrate, closed the police ledger, and buried the nightmare forever beneath the winter snows of the Danube Gorge. 4 days later, Sherlock Holmes and I were back inside the quiet, familiar sanctuary of 221B, Baker Street. Outside our window, London was wrapped in its usual blanket of dense, freezing November fog. The rain tapped rhythmically against the glass, but inside, a bright, roaring fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, warm shadows across the carpet. Holmes sat in his worn leather armchair, wearing his purple dressing gown, lazily poking the burning coals with the iron tongs. On the small mahogany table beside him rested his violin, his pipe, and the final telegram from Athens confirming that Sophie Cratyides had safely returned to her homeland under the protection of her family's estate trustees. I sat at my desk across the room, dipping my steel pen into the black inkwell, carefully smoothing out the final handwritten sheets of paper that made up my detailed account of the case. "So, Holmes," I said, pausing as I watched the black ink dry on the page, the official records in Hungary will forever state that Latimer and his scarred friend murdered each other in a fit of criminal greed. But we both saw the tracks in the snow. We both held that woven prayer bead left on the windowsill above the river. Holmes set the iron tongs back in the brass stand and turned his sharp, gray eyes toward me, a faint, cryptic smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Official reports are written for the public, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice dropping into a low, measured cadence. "They provide a neat sense of order to a world that is far more chaotic and vengeful than the courts care to admit." Latimer believed he could manipulate the legal machinery of 3 different nations to steal an empire and murder a helpless man in the dark. He forgot that there are older, darker laws than those written in the statute books of Scotland Yard. "Do you believe it was Sophie herself who tracked them to that lodge?" I asked, leaning forward, unable to contain my curiosity. "Or was it a relative, an agent sent from Athens to avenge Paul Cratides's blood?" Sherlock Holmes reached for his pipe, filled it with coarse black shag tobacco, and lit it with a glowing ember from the hearth. He took a long, thoughtful pull, sending a pale blue ring of smoke curling up toward the dark ceiling rafters. "Some questions, my dear Watson," Holmes said quietly, his eyes reflecting the deep crimson glow of the fire, "are far better left unanswered in our private journals. Justice was cheated in Newgate, but it found its way through the snow above the Danube. The Greek interpreter survived to speak the truth, the stolen fortune has been restored to its rightful heir, and the cold cellar in Beckenham is locked forever in the dark." He picked up his violin from the table, rested his chin gently against the dark wood, and drew the bow smoothly across the strings, filling the room with a haunting, melancholic melody that drowned out the sound of the storm outside. "Close the file, Watson," Holmes murmured over the music. "The Greek interpreter is finished, and another dark shadow is already gathering over London. Good morning. Good evening to you, boss. This has been disaster on the radio. Poisonous gas, twisted conspiracies, and a ruthless Greek vengeance that crossed continents to strike in the frozen night." Holmes closed his file, the interpreter lived to tell his story, and the bloody account of Beckenham is officially sealed. Until our next transmission, keep your lights on, lock your doors, watch the dark corners, and never translate a word for a stranger after midnight. Good night.